Thank you guys for joining me on my presentation, Shaping Masculinity, Exploring the Interplay of Environment and Identity in EMS. My name is Mamoon, and I was advised by Dr. Lance Laird, who's here in the crowd. So this project grew out of my own experience working as an EMT for the last few years, where I witnessed firsthand how masculinity shapes the culture of emergency care. I noticed that the traditional macho man was valued, sometimes at the detriment of mental health. That inspired me to ask a few deeper questions. How do EMS providers define masculinity? Does the EMS work environment cultivate these traits, or do certain people self-select into the profession? What coping mechanisms do they use, and how are these related to masculinity? And basically, why does this matter? EMS providers operate in a high-stress, trauma-filled environment. Understanding how masculinity intersects with the work and coping strategies is essential for creating better supports for them, as well as addressing burnout, which is a huge problem that literature supports. So, how did I do this? To explore these questions, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 10 EMS providers in Quincy, Massachusetts. These participants, a mix of EMTs and paramedics of varying experience levels, shared candid reflections on masculinity, coping, and the challenges that they've faced so far in their careers. I also used a qualitative research method called photo voice, where I tasked participants to take pictures that they associate with certain themes like coping. I then got the pictures back, developed the disposable cameras, and analyzed the pictures. I want to note my role as a participant observer in this study as well. My own experience working in EMS provided me with contextual insights that allowed me to support participants' responses beyond their individual experiences. I also want to note one key methodological choice that I took. There was no predefined definition of masculinity going into these interviews. I instead opted to have participants define it for me and run off their definition for the course of their interview. Another thing that I want to ensure was confidentiality between participants, because although it's an anonymous study, in a work environment, people are really close, and you don't want interpretations of your own experiences to get around. So before we get into the meat of my project, I just created a little quick quote legend. These are 3 of the demographic criteria that came up: paramedic, EMT. Paramedics all had to be EMTs at some point in the state of Massachusetts, and they also have a larger scope and area of practice than men or women, and less than 5 years of experience and greater than 5 years of experience. So let's look at this example fake quote. Private EMS is perfect, there's no issues at all. That was said by an EMT, that's a man that has less than 5 years of experience. So let's talk about a little bit of the survivorship and selection bias that came up. So in my study, I spoke with only those that are still obviously in EMS, so the people that were endured or adapted to the masculine environment, you could say. Another thing to note is that the people that I most wanted to talk to, the older EMTs that maybe have more conservative or traditional views, were less likely to participate for that reason, and that reluctance kind of highlights a generational shift. Older providers may hold more traditional views of masculinity and coping, which makes them less likely to talk. There was also a disproportionate number of women that were interested in participating in my study, reflecting that they kind of had this strong interest in discussing their gendered experience within this masculine, male-dominated field. It's funny, there was this quote, it's funny how more women wanted to share their experiences. It's almost like they've been waiting to be asked. So these are some of the themes. There's a lot more that I didn't include on this slide as well. I'm going to be talking about the first 4, but feel free to talk to me at any point about anything else in my project. The first 2, definition of masculinity and EMS culture, overlap a bit, and then we'll get into gendered experience and coping strategies. These are also just some pictures that have to do with coping, as well as the very organized nature of EMS. So first, let's talk about defining masculinity. When I first asked this question, I posed it, 1, how do you define masculinity, or what does masculinity look like to you, and how does this show up in the work environment? 2 separate things, and this is a question that actually stumped everyone. Everyone kind of has an understanding of what it is, but it's hard to put words into it. Ultimately, we were able to boil it down into these common themes, and they just so happen to align with traditional notions of masculinity. So things like toughness and stoicism, confidence and competence, protectiveness and service, and looking at some of the key words from these quotes: can't break down, bottle it up, looking like you know what you're doing, and the idea of protecting other people who can't protect themselves. So how does this transpire or manifest in this environment? It was interesting. There was a variation in how people recognized it. Male participants were less likely to recognize how masculinity shaped their work environment or influenced their behavior. For them, masculinity was often implicit and unexamined, whereas for women, they were acutely aware of their masculinity's influence and how they had to navigate or adapt to it. Every woman interviewed identified masculinity as a shaping force in their EMS experience. One of the paramedics even shared, in her experience, you don't have to say it out loud to know the rules, you learn them quick. And there's also this idea of a reciprocal relationship between EMS and masculinity, idea of like a chicken or the egg dilemma. Does EMS attract people with these traits, like my research question was asking, or are people kind of shaped into these traits over time? And my evidence kind of suggested both. EMS, emergency service, critical patients, it's stressful work, it's high energy work that's fast paced, and it kind of rewards stoicism and grit, the nature of the work. But for many of those who stay in the profession, these traits are also reinforced and normalized over time. Someone said, you learn pretty quick that the emotions slow you down. And if you slow down, something could go wrong or someone could get hurt. So looking a little bit at the gendered experiences and the response to this masculine environment, there was kind of a two-pronged approach that I saw between my responses. You either could embody the masculine traits, so this adaptation often required women to suppress emotional expression and adopt the gritty culture that commonly associated with EMS, but by mirroring traditionally masculine traits, they're able to be accepted by their male colleagues, but at the expense of suppressing a version of themselves that once existed when they first came into EMS. On the other hand, you have this idea of remaining soft as an act of discipline. One EMT said, it's easy to go hard and numb yourself. Staying soft, that takes work. And this idea is that they prioritize their emotional connection with patients and their colleagues, often facing subtle pushback as a result because they maintain this more nurturing approach, or even more so, this became their single identity as the soft one or the nurturing one. These women were also faced to more than just adapting their behavior. There was a lot of discrimination that came up in the interviews as well, which I'm happy to discuss outside of this just for the time's sake. These implicit biases kind of contribute to gendered role expectations, where women were often assigned specific calls or expected to take tasks that were perceived as softer, like providing emotional support to patients, whereas men kind of just got off with like heavy lifting and less involved tasks. So let's talk about the coping mechanisms. A lot of the coping mechanisms that came up had to align with like the masculine energy within EMS, things like detachment and dark humor. If you can't joke about it, it'll eat you alive. Humor is how we survived. And this also varied based on who's in the room. So because it's dark humor, you're making fun of patients, you're making fun of women, you're making fun of minorities within the group. So if those people are present in the room, those conversations weren't happening as much. Also physical outlets. The gym is my therapy. It's where I process everything without talking. I also want to note some of the lack of institutional support that showed up in EMS. Because Brewster is a private EMS company, they don't have the same resources that state employees get. So they're contracted to do state work but don't have the same benefits. So that lack of institutional support leads to an individual responsibility on providers to find coping for stressful calls. So moving into some of these images, because the photo voice kind of leewayed nice into the coping mechanisms. One person said, any day where I can do something that's not just this job feels like a good day. You need that separation and it all just blends together. And you can see somewhat in these pictures, going outdoors, getting nature, a little bit of time away, separation from that environment was very helpful. Same thing here, going out, spending time with friends outside of EMS and trying things in a very different environment also came up. You might note these are very normal things that we all do that also reflects the humanity within EMS providers, especially in contrast to their very traumatic work environment. There was also the idea of pets that came up often. Someone said, I used to just go home and drink after a bad shift. Now I try to talk it out with someone or my dog. And a lot of images of pets came up here. These are just 3 of them. But the idea of drinking, I'll mention a little bit later, comes up too. And the idea of talking with people within the field is huge within Quincy, that tight-knit community. But more importantly, I thought talking with people outside of work and even pets showed that separation from work. And these are some of the not so glamorous pictures. You can see a fresh pack of 12-pack of Celsius, and that's a picture after someone worked a 48-hour shift, the junk and trash left in their car. So, and then there's definitely energy drinks, 7-Eleven, and a lot of people smoke and use nicotine. Alcohol is also pretty big in Quincy, and it's not a direct response to bad calls, but it's part of the culture and kind of reflects the bad habits that are there. So, talking about my implications. Addressing these barriers isn't just about fairness. It's about improving retention, mental health outcomes, and the overall effectiveness of the EMS. Taking care of providers ultimately means better patient health outcomes. And for my next steps, I'm currently in talks with Brewster administration as well as the Quincy supervisors to get some of the findings here implemented in programs. At least on the Quincy level, working with Brewster administration company-wide is going to be a little bit tougher, and hopefully bringing back some of the trauma-informed response programs that they had at one point. I want to leave you guys on this. EMS is not just about saving lives. It's about navigating an intense culture where identity, coping, and survival are deeply intertwined. I think this quote summarizes it pretty well. In this job, staying human is the hardest part. Thank you all, and thank you especially to these people.
Any questions for Aaron?
Yeah, really good job. I had a question about the photo voices. What made you want to do the images and like have them have the cameras?
Yeah, so I first found out about photo voice in a pediatric asthma study, actually. So these pediatric patients, I'll try to keep it short, they came in presenting with asthma symptoms, but in the clinic, they didn't have the symptoms at home, they reported them. So they tasked the kids to take pictures of the home environment to see what was causing this, and they found different environmental stressors. I thought I could apply it more in a medical anthropology context within EMS because I've seen some of the visuals that support this masculine environment due to my participant observation. So I thought using photo voice would capture that for an audience that's not in EMS.
I know your study looks at how like EMS is shaped throughout, or how masculinity is shaped throughout EMS. What would you define masculinity as?
Good question. That also stumps me. I think I'll steal from some of the people that I asked this question. I think when I hear masculinity, I think it's often in a conversation of toxic masculinity. So I think masculinity to me is often rooted in toxic masculinity and combating that. So what does combating that look like? Kind of addressing the stuff that isn't traditionally associated with it, like emotional openness, and still ideas like protecting and serving shows up to me, but combining with more of the other side as well.
So I guess this is like a two-part question. When you first started, like your personal work as an EMT, what aspect was the most surprising in relation to your research study and like the topics that it explored? And then also, what was most surprising from like your qualitative investigation of it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the thing that motivated this and planted the seed in my head was when I first started working for Brewster. It was after I already had my certification and everything in our 2-day orientation. The educator was like this loud presence, like a lieutenant in a military almost. So at the end of our first day, which is more informational before the hands-on day, he goes, "If you don't feel like shit by the end of tomorrow, I'm gonna make sure you do." And I just thought that was funny because it's like, this is healthcare. But that was the thing that started it. And I think the one thing that came up in the qualitative interviews was the changing dynamic of it over time. When I did talk to a lot of older people, it was that like, just head down and focus, don't talk about it, and especially in fire departments. But because this is strictly EMS and not fire, there's a more medical focus, which takes away some of that like hustle mentality because it's linked to like intellectualism.
Great. Give it up for Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you guys.